about classification of typeface, whether it's a sans serif or a serif, a slab serif or a script, so on and so forth. We briefly touched on the tag, so whether that is something that is calligraphy or whether it's something that is rounded or geometric or what have you. These are just some tags. There's lots of tags out there, but it's basically describing the typeface more in adjective format than in classification format. What I do want to talk about this week is the fact that there's different properties within typefaces that we haven't really touched on too much. So you have thin typefaces and thick typefaces, and you have medium ones. You have condensed, which are ones that are very skinny. You have extended, which are very wide, and then regular. You have X heights, where you have a regular X height and a small X height or a large X height, and these oftentimes have to do a little bit with ascenders and descenders as well. And I specifically want to cover contrast. So contrast is within the letter forms. And if you think about within the anatomy of type that we learned last week, this is definitely something that you see depending on the typeface. So this, for example, has a lot of contrast. You can see between the letter forms how it gets really thin, where basically if it was a calligraphy pen would have turned, and that you have a different stroke weight within that. Same thing with this one, there is some contrast here. Whereas this one has very little contrast. It's roughly the same. There is contrast, but it's roughly the same between the different parts of the letter forms. So if I come over here and look at one that has no contrast at all, you can see it's irrelevant based off of what type of typeface it is, whether it's a display type or a body type, whether it's sans serif or serif. And ultimately what it means is that every single part of the letter is the same. So whether it's the stem, the bar, the ear, all of those are going to be the same width all the way around. Versus if I look at extreme contrast, you can see here that you start to get extreme differences between where those letters start to connect together. And so this is something that you want to consider when you're thinking about the typeface that you're choosing. If you have extreme contrast, it oftentimes does not work well for body copy. It can work well for display text, but it's really hard when you have extreme contrast within it that you're not going to be able to read it as easily as when you don't have it. So for example, here there is extreme contrast, but it's pretty subtle in terms of the thins and thicks, and so this might work for body copy, but something like this, you would lose a lot of the details of the letter forms as you got much smaller in the type. And so you want to be aware of this in terms of the letters that you're choosing, the letter forms that you're choosing, and what type of contrast it has. So this is something that I would encourage you all to play with and think about as you're choosing typefaces here. And then within them, sometimes, for example, you'll get typefaces that have different families. So here I can choose, hey, I want to have at least, let's say, at least, let's say 20 typefaces within that family. And if I then look at them, you can see how this is going to shift within it. And so this is really helpful, especially if you are choosing something that you want to have a display option and multiple options within it. Oftentimes what you'll get is you'll go from extra light to extra bold. You'll have a slightly italics, a normal, and then you might have it condensed and extended. Here you can tell that they have ones that are rounded bottoms and that you don't really notice those rounded bottoms in the other versions. So as you go through, you can kind of see how this shifts and changes. Here's there's no roundedness, and here there is. The larger it gets, the more contrast you start to notice. So here that there's more contrast within the H, right? So you have the stem, and then as it curves into the H here, we start to see that this is much, much thinner. But when we go to the other typeface, other font choices, here you don't get any of that contrast that's happening. And so you can kind of see how this might shift as you're looking at the different weights within the typeface. And so this is something you want to be cautious about as you're choosing which font within the typeface that you are choosing. In general, when you have contrast, like high contrast, but it's very small sections, like I would say this has high contrast, but it's only in the where the letter forms start to curve, and the rest of it tends to be pretty consistent. This is something that would still be fairly easy to read at smaller sizes. But if I did something like Bedoni, that tends to be a much more high contrast typeface, that's going to be significantly harder to see as you're getting into the smaller typefaces.